Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Coven today. I am here with my dear friend, Diana. Diana is like one of my absolute favorite people on this earth. I'm sorry. I just have to say it. You're phenomenal. You came to my birthday party. You got to meet my family. You are a great astrologer, a great musician, a great creative. And I've been trying to get you on the podcast for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, it feels like. And it's so great to finally have you here. You're a hard person to pin down, but I'm so happy finally collaborating.
Yeah, same. I think we did record once many moons ago. But
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Long
but I can definitely I can take that. It's definitely true. It's hard to pin people with lots of mutable energy in their charts down. But I think that's part of why we're a good team, because we kind of balance each other out.
Totally. Diana is a Gemini sun, a Capricorn moon, and a Sagittarius rising. And I just realized you've now shared 2 birthdays with me because you came over my home last year and we had cake, I believe, that I got. It was from this really great bakery in Boston that did John F. Kennedy's original wedding cake to Jackie. And so we got that, we ate it together. What else did we do? I feel like, I don't know.
Probably we just talked a lot of astrology.
Yeah. And then this year we did a murder mystery. So I'm just so happy to have you in my life and to have you here today. Today we're going to talk about something that we kind of just talk about all the time anyway. So it felt really natural. We're going to talk about the astrology today of grunge, which is just kind of maybe this astrology of the music of the 90s. Diana, by the way, is a musician. And also she does this really great podcast called Mystic Mixtape. And I'm actually going to be on an episode this season, so you guys can tune in for that. But Mystic Mixtape is just an incredible podcast, a music focused podcast about, esoteric beliefs where the crossovers are. Diana, I'm going to stop myself because I'll just keep talking and worshiping you, but tell me a little bit about Mystic Mixtape. How would you plug it, describe it?
Yeah, you did a good job of describing it. I think it's definitely music focused. We call it Mystic Mixtape because every episode has a companion playlist to go with it. And so music and the arts in general kind of anchored the discussion a lot of the time, but it kind of goes anywhere from astrology to tarot to just occult and esoteric symbolism and things like that, and just kind of exploring those connections. I think you are one of the only other astrologers like myself that looks at the charts, the astrological charts of albums. So that's definitely fun to talk about. But this upcoming season, we're going to have lots of exciting guests, including you and other very interesting people. So being a Gemini sun, I definitely am happy to have those conversations. And I just hope that people will check it out. And you don't have to be into astrology to get into it because we talk about other stuff too.
It's pretty great. I was listening to it in the shower a couple of days ago, and not only is your voice super relaxing, number one, but I just feel like it's just such a calming podcast to my ecosystem. Sometimes I listen to a lot of true crime, or I'll watch blind stuff, and so it can get kind of dramatic. So your podcast is just great to kind of relax to. I don't have to think too much. I can just enjoy. So if you're looking for a great podcast to sort of space out to, I would recommend it. It's one of my favorites, and I'm so excited as a fan to have a new season ahead of us. Diana, what you've done a lot of stuff in this break. You had a little surgery. I'm so glad you're doing okay. You've been making art again, which is cool. And you were just in a Smashing Pumpkins video, which is kind of exciting. Guys, there's a new Smashing Pumpkins song. It's called Beguiled, and really cool music video with a lot of extraordinary dancers and weird psychedelic imagery. And of course, Diana.
Yeah. Yeah, watch carefully, you might see me in there. Beguiled is a really sort of unique thing as a music video goes, because it was a single take. It was done completely live, which is why it has that sort of imperfect, rough charm to it. And it was live on TikTok. So yeah, that's the backstory there. And that whole experience was just so much fun. You know, I feel like anyone who knows me knows I've always been a huge fan of the Pumpkins, being from Chicago. Um, and just like yeah, kind of enjoying that, right? The band has been touring, so that's been great. Them and Jane's Addiction just did a tour. So for me, like seeing these kind of 90s acts like being popular again, or being popular with younger listeners, is really exciting. The wholesome part of me really loves the like intergenerational vibes at the shows, right? You see people now that are old heads who are like young at these same band shows in the 90s that have their children with them now at the show, and it's just like so cool. I'm somewhere in between those two generations, so I kind of just observe, and it's really cool and fun. And I feel like it's no coincidence that we're talking about this stuff, right? Because um, Saturn just entered Pisces, and I feel like, you know, Saturn was in Aquarius and then into Pisces in the early to mid 90s, so it kind of feels really timely.
Yeah, I get that. It's so interesting to think about it because if I'm to go back in the Wayback Machine, to think about when I was young in the 90s, I was a kid, like what was the intergenerational band? And I guess it would be like the Rolling Stones. They came back in the early 90s. That was a big
Yeah.
thing. The Dead had like a revival in the early 90s as well. So like now Corgan, I guess, is Jerry Garcia or like Mick Jagger. Like a weird concept to think about. I'm sure that he might be flattered to hear something like that. But if you think about, you know, the commercialization of rock music, and we associate so much of that time period to being against that in a way. But
Yeah.
I'm acknowledging that that's exactly what it was. That I mean, that's
Yeah.
what a musician, you know, now or back then. Um, Nowadays, I guess there are some interesting ways that people can remain indie if they so choose. But the Pumpkins were never really kind of that band. But I guess maybe they get, you know, lumped into those types of bands because of the time period, perhaps. You know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that the spirit of grunge is very much like about confronting dark truths and kind of shedding light on things that people normally wouldn't talk about, right? Like these were Gen Xers kind of like pushing back against the polite, sweep it under the rug culture that their boomer parents raised them with. They were the first generation that were dubbed latchkey kids, right? These were people who were neglected or abused and were fucking sick. Am I allowed to curse? They were
Yeah.
fucking sick of that being kind of like swept under the rug and hidden. And it's so ironic to me that you know, slowly became like corporatized, because it's so like, yeah, countercultural, right? Like that's the whole spirit of it. Not unlike punk rock or metal, where it's just like giving the middle finger to polite, you know, normative society.
Yeah.
So
It's
definitely interesting to feel that energy again a little bit.
I'm here for it. I love it. And it's interesting to see, you know, the obvious comparisons. Like we just said, the comparison of rock stars, like from back then, and then who's the intergenerational rock star now. I think it's interesting to like look at, you know, who would be, I guess, the Kurt Cobain, who would be the Billy Corgan of this generation, etc. And do we not even have those types of archetypes anymore? You know, have we completely wiped those out? That's a whole conversation for another day we could have, I bet.
Wow.
But let's dive a little bit into the astrology of that. So like I think a great place to start probably is thinking about Saturn, because Saturn is structures. It is, you know, the glue that sort of holds everything together. I have this theory that like, if we're going to talk about pop culture, we might associate it as like a Venetian thing, but it's not, because culture is, again, we might think it's a Jupiterian thing, even, Jupiter rules culture. But if we're talking about pop culture, I feel like pop culture is kind of like the structure of society. So it's like skin and bones. It's no different. It's kind of what holds everything together, because it's a reflection, it's a reaction. So I think Saturn might be one of the attributes of pop culture, in that it is kind of how it's structured, whereas Pluto is like the generational undercurrent that comes from it, the change, the transformation that comes from the culture. So Saturn being in Aquarius, right? This gives rise to these very, like, for people who are very new to astrology that listen to this podcast and you're like, what the hell is she talking about? Like, Saturn is, again, that structure, that, form to things, right? And Aquarius is groups of people. It's people coming together for a cause, something like very altruistic. It's also what's independent. So what is, against the grain, something that's like the outcast, the black sheep. Diana, I'm sure you can elaborate more. What are some themes that come to mind for you for Aquarius?
Well, definitely the fact that, the traditional ruler of Aquarius was Saturn. So this is a domiciled planet. So that means its energy, it's going to express itself pretty readily. And of course it did in the prior sign of Capricorn, but Aquarius really, being an air sign, kind of really, I think, has more to do with like mass consciousness, right? Capricorn has more to do with like structures in society, and Aquarius is sometimes about undoing some of those structures or questioning them, subverting them. It's much more intellectual, and it's much more open to, I guess, reform. Reform is a huge, like, and revolution. Those are Aquarius words to me. I don't have Aquarius placements like you do, so I may have a different perspective on
No,
it. But
really, you're right on. I just wanted to include you into the conversation. Otherwise, we'll just talk forever as, two neurotypicals. We can just kind of go on our tangents. But yeah, I think revolt, revolution are all, very Aquarian things. You think of John Lennon, he has Aquarius moon. What is he known for? The song Revolution, like his protest. I mean, Aquarius is the protest. It's the mad scientist. It's the person that comes in and says, we're doing it this way. Maybe we could do it this way. And that actually helps us in the future to do X, Y, and Z. And, so it's that change. It's also like earthquakes are very, Uranian. So accidents.
That makes so much sense, right? If you combine the energy of Uranus being chaotic and sudden, and with Saturn's earthly quality, earthquakes are like a perfect way to look at that, both symbolically and literally.
Fact. So I'm thinking about this in terms of, let's talk for just a second about like what the culture was going into the 90s. Let's talk about 1990. 1990 was a very interesting time. When we begin a new decade, we're not sure what has phased out from the prior decade. So you get these interesting periods of time. One of the great examples of this I always like to give from a pop culture standpoint is thinking about 1980, from 1979 moving into the 80s. It took a little bit to get to the 80s that we know. So I always think about Freaks and Geeks, because Freaks and Geeks, takes place in Michigan in 1980. So it's this time where it's a show that like aesthetically can look very 70s, right? But in some ways it's also, you have the stoners, you have that like association of what like late 70s, like they're talking about Rush, they're talking
yes
about Zeppelin still. But then, at the same time, it's this culture shift. You get to like the geeks and they're very into like Billy Joel and like that's again, they're 70s artists, but like moving into that structure of 70s at straddling the 80s. So you get these like weird archetypical times that like we're in between the future and the past, right? So 1990, you sort of see the end of hair metal kind of thing. And everything was really big and excessive in the 80s. Even if you think about sonically, like drum sounds are a great example of that. You know, in the 80s, you had these big basketball sounding, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of things were electronic and stuff like that. And then you get into the 90s and you hear, you know, a completely different kind of subversive, almost grunge to many people, like who are older, kind of unlistenable drum sound. They're like, what is this? You know? And it's like, so 1990 comes, and the people who, you know, were all about this, you know, I guess they were kind of getting phased out, because the alternative to that were people who were like, this is not for me, and they went underground and they found other subversive things, whether it was, you know, glam rock of the 70s, Bowie coming along, then punk rock kind of coming out, and all of these different underground hardcore kind of being developed underground. And so all these people, they've congregated, these alternative people, you know, and that's not the majority, right? You know, the other people are listening to, I don't know, Motley Crue or whatever, and
Yes.
about moving to the Sunset Strip or something, you know, and being in a beer can ad, like all of these associations we might have with that time. And then these people are finding things that are much more interesting, much more subversive. Maybe in some ways they're talking to them about values. They're talking to them about, you know, new ideas, new ways of doing things. And so getting back to that idea of Uranus and Aquarius being that sign of sudden shocks, nobody can really expect it when this band from the Pacific Northwest, who, you know, had a recording budget of, I don't know what, significantly probably less than Motley Crue or, you know, Guns N' Roses or any of those bands, creates, you know, goes to Sound City. If you've seen the film, you know, that Dave Grohl did on Sound City, where they recorded Nevermind, the shithole in the valley, basically. No one can expect it when that is like outselling Michael Jackson, you know? So it's this big moment of like, not only is the bigness, the sound moving out, but it's becoming more raw and more visceral and more reactionary, and you hear mistakes, and that's delightful, and it almost adds charm to it. But you're also getting bands that are extraordinarily sick of the excess. They're getting back to basics. These are people that don't have shit, you know. There was a lot of emphasis on rock stardom and excess, and these were like America's people. If we're thinking about like what America is, you know, these are people who are working paycheck to paycheck, you know, like that look like, you know, the stoner at the outside of the mall your mom tells you to avoid. wearing
Yeah.
and all these men are wearing makeup and all these things, which is, they're like, that's cool too, but like they're not that. They're wearing, you know, gross flannel oversized shirts and broken jeans, and so
Yeah.
it's like this weird culture shock, you know.
Yeah, I definitely think about like Saturn and Capricorn being like the preceding years, right? In the 80s, we had, you know, stuff like Reaganomics and, you know, I don't want to get too into stuff like that, but obviously that was designed to advantage the advantaged and kind of continue a certain pattern with regard to resources, right? And then we think about like culturally, like, yeah, we had stuff like glam rock. We had there was the satanic panic. I find that so funny, right? Like Saturn transiting through Capricorn, the tarot card of the devil being its association, and
Which
people being afraid.
we're experiencing that again, which is very interesting to think about. Guys, there are people on the internet that are so dedicated to thinking that Sam Smith and Kim Petras are like creating satanic panic.
I think, I mean, there's an obvious reason for that one, right? We can think like, okay, these are just queer people that are being maligned for being openly queer, in my opinion. I don't want to say that either of them identify as such, LGBT, whatever you want to say.
I think they would both identify as that.
Yeah. And so like I feel like Aquarius into Pisces like has so much to do with questioning, right? Aquarius asks those hard questions and like challenges us to think about like, does this actually make sense now? Like the things that we did before might have made sense for that time, but does that still work now? And then when you get into Pisces energy, it's like throw everything out the window, like anything is possible.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of people might feel threatened by that, people who might have more Capricornian tendencies and want stability and predictability and everything in a neat little box, they're going to be kind of freaked out by things that challenge that. I think that it's pretty common for like the parent generation to criticize their children's generation, and certainly during like, you know, hip hop in the early 90s and grunge, there was a lot of like judgment coming from the older set that were like, oh, these kids are too political, or they play too loud, or why is this recording not more polished, or you know, why do they dress like that? Things like that that just make them sound old and grumpy and out of touch. I
Yeah.
feel like we're going through that a little bit again, where like the younger artists that are out there just kind of doing their thing are being dragged or demonized for weird things, like you said, satanic panic. I
It's
don't know
very,
where that's coming from.
yeah. So 1991, there's this big moment where the underground, the independent music scene kind of becomes the mainstream, Nirvana being the catalyst to that. When we talk about grunge, I want to just say that, this was a title of a show, just because it made it easier. But grunge is not real. Like, it's not like this is like a Time magazine, advent to describe punk rock music or independent music or music that was, influenced by heavy metal, but had, more of a value system. So like, or hardcore, or shoegaze in the case of the Smashing Pumpkins. But yeah, like grunge is an advent of commercialism. It's not a real thing. But there were, if we were to identify grunge as what is a concept, I mean, it would have there's geographic standpoints, right? That would be Seattle
Yeah.
bands from the Pacific Northwest. So we have
Mm-hmm.
Nirvana, we have Mother Love Bone, which becomes Pearl Jam, and so we have Pearl Jam. We also have Temple of the Dog, which combines Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, another one. Soundgarden had been already around for a significant period of time before this, but then they kind of shift their sound a little bit. And then we have, I guess, we have a lot of other bands that obviously I'm not going to mention, but are there any significant bands that come from that you would consider grunge that maybe I left out that are geographically grunge?
So anyone from the Pacific Northwest, I mean, I don't know if I
Oh,
would consider.
duh. I'm like,
But
I know I'm something. Alice in Chains would be also.
Alice in Chains is, yeah, like for me, honestly, like one of the first bands I think of when someone says grunge. Um, you know, I certainly agree that grunge is more of a buzzword that people kind of glommed onto. Like, I feel like maybe someone just jokingly was like, "Oh, it's grunge," and then they're like, just took it and ran, and like, you know, I
Like
just
a
don't even.
or something. I used to know this. I probably should have researched it. However, it is what it is. We're not talking about the history of grunge today. We're talking about the astrology of grunge.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd consider Hole a grunge band or not.
But I think that they get kind of wrapped up into that as well. Um, I mean, Hole is a pop band to me. If you were to ask me, they are a heavy influenced band during their first two albums, but they are a pop band. You might not think of Pretty on the Inside being a pop record. It's really not. But I think if you were to ask Courtney, she would probably be a little bit more proud of celebrity skin, that like lived through this, which is like a completely, incredible record. I mean, it's arguably what people kind of hold up as her what would you say? I'm trying to think of the word. Her finest piece of art.
Yes, her opus, her, I don't
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
I agree with that for sure. And I think actually that's a really important component of the whole like schema of grunge, is that women were starting to become a part of the conversation in a way that in the 1980s really wasn't the case. I mean, sure, you had your Pat Benatars, your Lita Fords, but for the most part, like, you didn't see a lot of that. And in the music industry in particular, like behind the scenes roles were almost exclusively male. And in the 90s, you started to see like grunge bands having female managers and things like this. So
Silver, I feel like, is like somebody that comes to mind. Like, and also that, a manager should be something that we know. Like, this is a generation, I have to say, and this might be very hyper specific. I don't know if you're the same, but this was a time where I knew who managed every band. Like, I knew that Susan Silver was the Soundgarden person. I knew that Danny Goldberg was the Nirvana person. Like, I knew that John Watson was the Silverchair person, So it's a time where you also weirdly know what's happening a lot behind the scenes, which I think is a Saturn and Pisces thing, which we'll talk about.
yes.
But like, you're much more aware of, and also maybe just the fact that it's a group thing, which is Saturn and Pisces, that like a band is not just its members, they are their
Yeah.
publicist, they're their manager. But you're right,
Mm-hmm.
there were more women, and like it was more a place where women could feel safer at shows, I feel, than, if you go to a Motley Crue concert and you're a woman, I don't know how safe you're necessarily going to feel in 1989, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Nirvana shows, I mean, they were mostly women in the front rows. Like, they were a band that was beloved by women because they spoke about women. They had a literal lyric, if I never met a wise man, if it so it was the woman, So they were speaking directly to women in a way that was not sexual and not derogatory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes but when they did, it was about their life,
Right. No, I get what you're saying. Totally. There was definitely like more of a sense that women were seen as equal to men. Like you could sort of speak of them in the same manner instead of just purely objectifying them. And sort of like the sort of dynamic of like male power being like, kind of cock rock energy of the 80s. Definitely, I love that a lot of the elements from metal and hardcore and punk carried over into the 90s, but without a lot of that misogyny and boys club energy.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, maybe I'm going to notice this more as a woman, or as a person who navigates the world looking like one.
For sure.
um, and that is probably a huge part of why even at a very young age I resonated so strongly with this music, because I don't think it's typical that like a kindergartner would necessarily listen to Nirvana, but I did.
Yeah, me too. I remember specifically the first time I heard Nirvana, which I think is like, our generations. Where were you when Kennedy was shot? Where was the first time that you heard Nirvana? Like, that's a pretty big first date question.
And if
uh,
they're like, I don't know, then you're like, okay, we're not having a second date conversation.
exactly. Totally. Anyway, yeah. So I think that was part of it too. And of course, Nirvana was very influenced by what was going on in Olympia, Washington, where they were living at the time. So that, like, there was a movement of riot girls, which, riot girl again is just like a thing that is advent. Anything can be, according to Kathleen Hanna, who's the founder of Riot Girl, uh, anyone can be a riot girl. you don't own the name, anyone can do this, it's just being against oppressive culture. So Cobain, grows up, you know, well, I guess he grows up in Aberdeen, but at this time he's in a college town. And so he's very influenced by the feminist literature that he's reading. And so that's an active part of it too. So Saturn in Aquarius, independent music, really infiltrating the culture. And if you think about it from like a wide scope, it makes you kind of want to cry to think that at the end of the day, one girl who went through a really fucked up incident, if you know the story, with her roommate, gets so upset about a sexual assault that happens to her friend, and it creates this fire inside of her that creates a whole movement. And then that movement, is participated by, a young 20-something-year-old Kurt Cobain, who's like, I believe this, I feel this. And then he takes that and he transmutes that to the rest of the world, in which he's like remembered forever by these values. That's his North Node. It's in Taurus. If you guys don't know, Kurt Cobain's North Node is in Taurus. Taurus is values. So he brought values to the world. And then you think about that really infamous picture of him holding Francis, and his shirt's lifted up and it says family values.
I mean, tell me you're a Cancer moon without saying you're a Cancer moon, right? Like,
I love it. And it's just very interesting. And then I guess there's also that parallel too, just to think about that story even further. And I don't want to talk exclusively for an hour about Kurt Cobain, but you think about what was going on in his life at that point. He was at the height of his success, and he was going through a really difficult time where his daughter was taken away from him by the state, because of a Vanity Fair article that had come out that alleged that his wife was using drugs when she found out that she was pregnant, and that she was smoking a cigarette, I believe. And they took their kids away, and our child away. And it was very hard for him. And I think about that in terms of like right now, because, there's obviously the comparison that I've been talking about a lot with what's happening with Brody Dahl right now with the same Los Angeles Family County Court, and you guys can go, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there's a website, istandwithbrody.com. You can see the parallels. And these two women have been compared their entire careers, Brody Dahl and Courtney Love. So I think that that's interesting to know.
Definitely. I definitely also think that, like, when you were talking about the Vanity Fair article and everything, I'm like, oh, that's because Pluto was like transiting his third house. So this planet of destruction was in the house that rules over media and written words and things like that.
Yeah.
I guess it was for you too. Anyone who has a Virgo ascendant in whole signs, those years of Pluto and Scorpio which is like, I guess, the late 80s through the mid 90s, that whole period would have been quite transformational in terms of themes of like voice and expression. And then I think about how Saturn and Pisces at the time also opposed a lot of those Virgo planets that were generational to those people like Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain and Billy Corgan and Courtney Love, who all were born in the late 60s when, Uranus and Pluto were transiting Virgo. A lot of these people also have other Virgo placements. So that Virgo Pisces opposition energy was very present, which I find really interesting too. I see a lot of the sort of analytical quality of Virgo being like shining that light on a lot of social problems, right? Like not just misogyny, but also abuse, neglect, drug problems, things that like hurt people. Those are certainly Piscean themes too. So it's just an interesting thing to explore as far as like the archetypal Virgo as giving service to society, Pisces as kind of elevating, washing away, cleansing the things that used to be problematic or hurtful. I think that people think about grunge music, whatever that is, right? as something that's kind of like angsty and aggressive, and that's true, but I feel like the spirit definitely has a lot of sensitivity to it and a lot of hopefulness for a better world, right? Because you can't really be that fucking pissed off and angsty unless you have ideals that are not being lived, that aren't being reflected in the world. Sounds very Pisces Saturn too.
Totally. I love that. So let's scope out. We talked a little bit about Seattle, the geographics of grunge. But there's other things happening at the same time. It's the big world that we live in. So we have, if we think about it in LA, what's happening in LA? We have, this is like, post-hardcore, I guess you could say. So we have Rollins living in LA at that time with Joe Cole. They're pre Joe Cole passing away. And so they're very active people. And, you have the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and that's a big time in LA. Like you think about the early 90s in LA, I'm sure that's an association. You have Hole kind of forming at that time too.
Jane's Addiction,
Yeah.
L7.
Yeah. That the L7's a big one too. And you have a lot of crossover with L7 and Hole too, with Jennifer Finch. And L7, that's a great place to start. L7 is, another example of a band that is kind of doing things in a very unique way, bringing kind of underground fuck you attitude to the mainstream. I always think of
Mm-hmm.
Anita Sparks and the tampon incident, of course.
Yes.
One of the coolest humans to have ever walked the earth. And,
And they still rock too. Like,
yeah,
I recently saw them perform live and I was blown away because obviously they're older now than they were in the 90s, but they still have all of that energy and attitude. And it's so wonderful to see that survived.
yeah, incredible foundational women. Jennifer Finch, I feel like, is a foundational person in the rock scene. She's just her and Donita Sparks are two of my favorite 90s humans. So L7, they're very heavy, they're very metal influenced. And, I would argue that L7 is a band that's harder than most dudes. And I think that they don't do sort of like fuck you sort of way. That's just genuinely who they are. They are being themselves. They are true weirdos. And I love and appreciate that. Of course, I'm talking about L7 and things just fall off the wall. So about that, guys.
Perfect.
Yeah. So they're pretty foundational group. Who else for you is like significant?
Those were the two that really came to mind as far as LA goes.
Well, then let's start there. I think that's a good place to start. So I just thinking about it, like Donita Sparks is a Venus in Pisces. And so I'm also thinking about this as Saturn moves into Pisces in what's that, 93. So we're moving into 93, 94 area. Saturn is beginning to, hit her Venus, which is like making her very serious and like structured in what she has to do artistically. She's meeting the man, so to speak. And there's a lot of Venus and Pisces people that are being challenged at this time with the establishment meeting up with their art. So you'll find a lot of Venus and Pisces people during this time really becoming like real like craftsmen, craft women, craft people with like they're creating new structures for the world to live in artistically, musically. And so she's definitely someone I put into that category. And then of course, let's talk about Hole for a moment. Like, this is the rise of Hole. They start off becoming like, they're a very noisy band. They're trying to make almost like a power violence grindcore kind of record. And for people who have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, very fast, very very abrasive music. When you think about what punk rock is in like a film. Like that's kind of what I would say it is. It's noisy, it's to some people unlistenable. There's a lot of sounds. And then I also think about, there's a collage aspect that I always really loved about early Hole. It's very audio zine ish if you think about it. There's all of these samples of like answering machine messages, and then like that weird abrasive sound of like when you're rewinding something when it's still playing and it's like timeout. Yeah, it's like that noise, and that like collaged my childhood in such a way. It was like, and that was like a big thing in the 90s, like, having a sample from a movie or something beginning your song, or
Yeah, that's so Saturn and Pisces. I mean, right? Like Pisces and Neptune rule over film and media. So it's so interesting to see that applied that way.
Yeah, so that's like very foundational to me. And so like a lot of these people are being challenged too, between like making a deal with the devil, I guess you could say, which is the music industry. Some people handled it better than others, but you have a lot of Pisces placements kind of entering this sort of challenge in life. If we scope back a little bit, we can bring this kind of full circle, I think, by talking about Chicago. So meanwhile, in Chicago, the Pumpkins are doing their thing, getting ridiculed by the underground. That they were not as embraced, I think, by certain bands like Sonic Youth or Nirvana, because they were doing totally different things. And
yeah, the Nirvana's in this. Sorry, go ahead.
No, continue, please.
I was
please.
just gonna say, like, the Nirvanas and the Sonic Youths, in my opinion, were drawing musically more from punk and its related genres, whereas the Pumpkins were maligned in part because they were drawing from things like prog rock of the 70s, which to a lot of people in the 90s were like their dad's music or their mom's music, right? So it's like, oh, that isn't cool. Why are they, why are they trying to sound like the Bee Gees or Rainbow or something, right? Like you shouldn't have these elements, like it's not punk rock.
Yeah.
And of course too, the Pumpkins rose to success relatively quickly. And I think too, like it's kind of interesting to chart that trajectory. Like, their first album came out in 1991, Gish. And then a couple years later, we had Siamese Dream, which is probably one of their most iconic albums.
Yeah.
Which would align with the time period we're talking about, I think, like around 93-ish.
Can we talk?
And that's when they really started to get popular. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Can we talk for a second? I think that this is like a good example. We're in Saturn and Pisces right now. So like thinking about Siamese Dream, first of all, Pisces rules dreams. So that's like the most obvious thing. And dreams are highlighted and painted beautifully in psychedelic imaginative imagery in your mind throughout every Smashing Pumpkins record. They contain different colorscapes in my mind. I'm sure they do for you as well. Different imageries are evoked. It's very dreamy. Like I almost can feel it as throughout my body, even just talking about a band like the Smashing Pumpkins. And so I think about the imagery of their lyrics and how Saturn and Pisces they are. A song Mayonnaise, even, it's magical. It's like the most beautiful poem that you've ever stepped into. You're imaginatively in this new world. A door is opening, and you're in it with them. They're a band that brings you into a feeling, if that makes sense.
It does to me, it's that convergence between the aesthetic, like visual and sonic, I think. And then of course, like you were saying, the lyrics too being so poetic. I think about like how Pluto was going through the sign of Scorpio then, and for Billy and lots of other musicians who were born around the same time, they have Neptune in Scorpio. So I think Pluto meeting up with Neptune had something to do with it, or, at least in the same sign. I think for Billy, like, it was probably a really interesting time as a Virgo rising, Pluto being his third house. So all about lyrics, words, communication. And then you have Pluto hitting his natal Mars in Scorpio. That's pretty intense, right? Like Siamese Dream is an album that is really just about processing your trauma.
Yeah.
It's very funny to me in a way that, and there are other themes in it, of course, but that's a overarching one in my opinion. And if you think about it, like, you don't usually find an album with that kind of content to be like such a big hit.
Yeah.
My cousins, who are just a few years older than I am, who are in high school in the 90s, I was looking through like their yearbooks one time when I was a kid, and I saw like, and they grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. And I was looking through it, and there are so many kids wearing the t-shirt with the red SP heart logo on it in their school picture. I was just cracking up. I was like, this was so big. I mean, of course, again, suburbs of Chicago, probably a little more prevalent here than other parts of the country. But the pumpkins were everywhere, and they got shit for it, but in my opinion, it was kind of deserved attention, as was Nirvana's, right? Some people were probably sick of seeing Kurt Cobain on magazine covers, but I think to a lot of us, it's impossible to get sick of like seeing an artist who is so sincere and so raw, and so able to draw us into their landscapes of pain and confusion and yearning and angst and frustration, but somehow make it like a catharsis, right? Like for me, when I listened to this music growing up, not having the easiest time in life, that helped me through some really hard times. Like just, listening to all of Nirvana's albums, listening to Hole, listening to Smashing Pumpkins, like these things really helped me cope with a lot of stress that, is related to having traumatic experiences, and being treated differently if you're a woman, things like that previously weren't really talked about. Like I love listening to, I don't know, Jefferson Airplane with my dad, but they never touched on that same level. They never hit like that. So I definitely appreciate, like for me, like all of my idols growing up were Gen Xers who were just ripping the band-aid off and kind of like saying what the fuck is going on here, and the irony of that becoming a mainstream thing. Even now, like I'm probably going to sound like I'm 900 years old, but people are like, oh, this is soft grunge, and they post like a makeup look, and I'm like, okay honey, no, like grunge makeup is just like hastily applied like red lipstick and some black eyeliner and you call it a day, and if it gets smeared, oh well. It's
Yeah.
not this like heavily like I'm going to contour this and highlight that. Look, do whatever you want, but to those of us who are actually like cognizant in the
It was ill.
1990s.
I feel like there was like an emphasis in the 90s too on like paleness. I always think of like Courtney with like the powder, like that was it was
Yeah.
all kind of look, if anything. Um I'm thinking a little bit about the Chiron story too, because I feel like so many people who rose to fame. I mean, if you were born in the 1960s, then you have Chiron in Pisces. And so Saturn's also transiting that. And I think that that's also a significant story. I mean, off the top of my head, Cobain obviously had that. Billy Corgan obviously had that. Two of the biggest voices of the 90s. Can we talk a little bit about Chiron in their story? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, especially like I was talking about the themes of like pain and just living through harsh experiences. This is very Chiron type stuff to talk about those things, and as a personal healing, but also like you're almost healing because you're helping other people.
Yeah.
I think that's a very Chiron thing. For I'm looking at, so even though Chiron was in Pisces, there's not a conjunction of Sun and Chiron for Cobain, but there is for Corgan. They're
Yeah.
like 1 degree apart. It's a tight conjunction of Sun and Chiron in the seventh house. So it's like, and I can speak to this because I have the exact same configuration, different sign, but tight conjunction, Sun Chiron, seventh house. I know what that feels like.
Yeah.
And basically it's like you have to let all of that painful shit like hang out, right? Because the seventh house is about other people witnessing your pain when
Yeah.
you're talking about Chiron seventh house stuff. And that becoming like a conduit to self-healing through healing others. I think the fact that a lot of young people responded to the Pumpkins music so strongly and they developed a loyal fan base so early on of a lot of younger people probably had some kind of healing effect on the band, or at least on Billy as the kind of head of the band.
Yeah.
Chiron for Cobain certainly still played a role, right? Let's see, his ascendant is Virgo. So I think he has a Chiron ascendant opposition. He does. So I think that's very fitting, right? Like
For
what
sure.
the world sees of him and like how he feels about himself. There's like this inherent tension there. I feel
Yeah.
like when Chiron ascendant stuff happens, there's almost like this painful quality to being like judged or witnessed. And as we know, Cobain was a very kind of private person. He didn't handle like most Virgo ascendants. I mean, you can be public facing, but if you don't have your space away from the world, that is not going to be good. You know, I think that solitude is necessary for someone with a Virgo rising. There's kind of that modesty or like not wanting all attention on you all the time typically.
For sure.
And especially with all that Piscean energy, it's just like too sensitive to handle all that crap. And in the 90s, we have to remember, like for those who listen and are perhaps younger in age, maybe you don't remember how horribly aggressive media was in the 90s. I mean,
Oh
like you
yeah.
said with the Vanity Fair article, it's awful to those accusations that were made against Courtney. And there were awful things said about pretty much everybody, about how they looked, about, you know, did they use drugs? And it wasn't respectful. It wasn't oriented toward how do we help this person heal? It was just almost like, we're going to put you on this pedestal and then we're going to knock you off of it and we're going to get pleasure from your fall.
Totally.
And it's so, to me, very, very Piscean, very Chiron energy.
Yeah, making martyrs out of people for sure. I can't help but think a little bit about, also, I want to just talk about this Chiron theme when it comes to Pearl Jam, because what occurs to me is the story of Alive, which I think is a pretty powerful story. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, I'm going to tell it really briefly. So when Eddie, and this is a very good astrological story because it's a generational story. So we're going to think about it. When Eddie Vedder was a little kid, he found out that his father, the person he thought was his father, was not actually his father. It was another person, and that his mom never told him this and was telling him this because that person had died. And she didn't quite know how to have that conversation with him, and so it wasn't handled in the best way at the time. And so his first thought as a young person was, this is a curse. Like, my dad is dead, but I'm still here. What am I supposed to do? And I think that this is an interesting generational story because, this is obviously happening around Pluto in Libra. And this is a very stereotypical Pluto and Libra story. These are the first children of divorce. really. And we don't know how to talk about it yet. And so it's not always handled in the easiest, most polite, wrapped up way, because it's something we're still trying to navigate and figure out culturally. And so, it was in his mother's opinion, his best interest for him not to know that his natural father was not his natural father after she remarried. She wanted him to have some, stability, right? Some sense of, functioning like a normal family, which you totally understand. Like, and so if you think about it from that perspective, it's a very powerful Pluto and Libra story. But also at this time, we're thinking about it in the sense of he writes this song Alive for, their debut album 10. Alive becomes, of course, one of those opuses, as you would say, like of Pearl Jam's story. And he confronts this feeling, this thing that happened to him when he was a kid. And as he began to play the song live in front of audiences across the world over time, he started to think about, well, the curse is lifted, because other people are hearing this song and they don't interpret this story as I'm still alive. He meant the lyrics, I'm still alive, like it's a curse, that I'm still alive. It was sarcastic. And all these kids would hear the song and they would think whatever pain that they were going through, that they were transmuting, they would hear alive and they would be like, yes, I have the will to live. I'm still alive. And so this song shape shifts. It becomes something new. The curse is lifted. And I think that that's such an interesting story. Saturn opposing his moon, his family.
Yeah.
There is a Virgo moon. And so it's a curse being lifted. I just love that as an astrological story.
Yeah, that's so cool. I think it's so interesting too that, with Alive, there's a similar dynamic in play with Smashing Pumpkins song Today, where people are like, oh, this is such a cheery song, like sounding song. This is such a cheerful music video. It's so fun and whimsical. And they don't realize, if they really pay attention to the lyrics, it's a song about committing suicide.
Yeah.
But I think perhaps a similar curse may have been lifted there by singing about it, and by the audience kind of taking it as an affirmation of having a wonderful day, even though that was also sarcastic. Um, Perhaps some kind of curse was lifted. And I think that really also can speak to the power of a concert as a ritual. I mean, to me, this might be my, fifth line in human design, like heresy energy coming through. I know we both have that anyway, so I assume that's fine. Um, but like, I almost feel like a concert is like really similar to like going to like a religious service. I always say that to people when they're like, oh, you're going out of your way to go to the show. I'm like, well, for me, this is church. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not joking, because people are gathering. There's a charismatic someone on stage. And everyone there is like, it's an energetic phenomenon, right? Everybody's like hearing and feeling in their bodies the same thing at the same time. And there is obviously going to be some kind of feedback between the audience and the performers. And it really is like a magical ritual of sorts. And I think that, you think of the word grunge and you think of how people looked, you don't necessarily think about magic and transformation and healing, but I think that that is a factor for sure.
Oh, yeah. I definitely think that that's, there's a magic to Saturn and Pisces to be able to transmute, to move with the flows of life. At least, everything sucks, but at least the music is good, like that. That's significant. Um, I'm curious. Like if I was just trying to look and see, I want to look at the eclipse cycles that were happening at this time. I think
Ooh,
that's
cool.
a start. Um, so let's take a look at that. So if we're thinking about where would you like to, do you want to start at like 91 or so?
Sure.
Okay, let's start at 91. I'm curious how, eclipses, for anybody who doesn't know, Diana, can you talk about eclipses for a moment while I'm looking this up?
I'll try. Solar eclipses or eclipses in general?
Eclipses in general.
Yeah, I think eclipses are really interesting. I often refer to them as like hitting a reset button because there's this kind of energy of like a pause happening, and you're like given that opportunity to sort of take stock of things and be like, what really is going on here? So eclipses can sometimes be those like aha moments that sort of make you go, oh, and like reassess everything. Like it's that important moment that you kind of realize something. At least that's kind of the most general description I can give. Wow, I'm seeing some stuff here that hit my
Yeah,
chart really strongly.
me too. Me too. I mean,
And
that's
we
not a
were youngins then, so we didn't have an easy time growing up, did we?
no. And I'm just thinking about this 92 lunar eclipse hitting, people who were born around the same time that I was born. I was born in 1983. But even beyond that, like a few years prior, the people who were born in the early 80s, this is hitting your Neptune. Neptune is music. So that's
Yes.
significant. I think that's the first thing that kind of sticks out at me. Of course, there are these Cancer eclipses, which many people in the 90s had a Cancer moon. Kurt Cobain, Courtney Love, you know Jay Mascis. He has, we have not mentioned at all, and is like a huge figure.
Oh, geez, yeah. Or, I mean, we need to talk about like, Melvins and Dinosaur Jr. and all these other bands. It's impossible to name them all.
Absolutely. But just thinking about all these Cancer moons, they're having this solar eclipse that's happening in 1992. And then we also can see that these Gemini lunar eclipses are occurring. And of course, this is hitting like Billy Corgan's moon. This is
Midheaven.
yeah, and his midheaven, and Courtney Love's Venus Mars conjunction is also happening at this time. Is this coinciding with the relationship or love triangle that is Corgan, Love, and Cobain? Um, okay, so do you mind talking about that? Can we talk about that? Because I think
Sure. I think it's hard to avoid because even though that was like 30 years ago now, people still talk about it.
the
So
music, it influenced the music. So the
that
reason I
too.
think is because this is really the story behind so many of the songs. So you look at like a song like Violet. Violet is like the most recognizable whole song, and it's written about Billy Corgan. And you have, of course, which pumpkin songs of this time? I know I can think off the top of my head of like a few later pumpkin songs, but which songs do you think are kind of love-esh?
I know Luna
Oh
on Siamese Dream is influenced, if not dedicated to her.
yeah,
And it's kind of funny too, because like if you're looking at astrology as a focal point, like the lyrics to the song Violet reference, like all the stars look like little fish, right? All the stars look just like little fish, I think is the right lyric.
yeah.
And that references Billy's sun sign of Pisces. And then you look at like Luna, I mean, the name of the song, like Courtney is a Cancer sun and moon.
There's
So that's a pretty obvious reference.
yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. So I think Luna is an obvious reference to her being a, lunar type astrologically. So we even like see that in the lyrics.
For sure.
Not that I don't always love breaking down lyrics because it's like, okay, well, do you really want to break down how someone made a painting or a poem? But I think this is a worthy conversation just because it is such a thread. I definitely, I'm not sure if there are any Nirvana songs I can think of off the top of my head that reference like a love triangle, but I know certainly Heart Shaped Box must be about Courtney.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are several
And
songs
countless
that
others.
aim towards them in general, not so much the Billy Corgan thing. I don't know if this is true or not, but I do have this cited in a book that apparently Kurt Cobain, according to Courtney, and it's in the book Courtney Love, The Whole Story by Poppy Zebright, that Billy was referred to by Kurt as the pear-shaped box, which I don't know why I remember and takes rent in my head for no charge. Um, one of the
Yes.
one of my favorite pages in literature is from the Poppy Z Bright book, Courtney Love, The Whole Story, where she explains in her words the love triangle between Kurt and Billy. And I'll have to, maybe I will edit this into it, but it is one of the funniest pages, and I believe 0% of it.
I think that, and that one thing I want to like throw out there too, since I mentioned like the sort of archetype of the fifth line in human design and the concept of being a heretic or a martyr. It seems to be a common thread here specifically too, right? Like Billy Corgan is a 5-1 profile. Courtney Love is a 3-5 profile. So they both carry that energy of the heretic or the martyr. And I think that in different ways that's been very apparent since the 90s.
Sure. Okay, so something I think that's interesting about these 94 eclipses, right? There's a solar eclipse at 19 degrees of Taurus. This is hitting the Chiron generationally for everyone that was born from about like 1978, 79 into about, I guess, 1984, 85, because
Mm-hmm.
it's 22 degrees for a very long time and kept going retrograde. So for many, many, many years, this is the Chiron. This is literally the wound of a generational wound, and that almost
Wow.
kind of want to cry to think about it. I've never thought about this before, but this is what's
Oh,
sticking to me, this generational wound. And then look at the timing. This is weeks after Cobain's suicide. So
yeah, less than a month. Wow.
yeah, so this is, and then we also see, this was his north node, right? And then we also see this is a time where, we see Courtney sort of becoming archetypically kind of this widow archetype. Like, what is she going to do next? Like, how is she going to, move on? And then we see this 94 eclipse in November in Scorpio. As I'm saying this, there's fire engines going on behind me, which I think is perfect. And we see are typically her transformation around, this time, stepping into this power role in a way. And, I think that's something also very significant that's happening at this time. But even beyond that, Taurus's values. So
Mm-hmm.
in 1994, we all got a new values check as a society. If you were born around this time, if you're like a late stage Gen Xer, I guess you could say, or early millennial, you this was a values upgrade. So we have the values changing significantly at this time for an entire culture, which I think is extraordinary. And then we have eclipses in November of 1994 as well, hitting, again, these people who have Chiron at that degree. And then we go to April 15th of 1995, and we see a partial lunar eclipse in Libra at 25 degrees, exactly happening on Courtney Love's ascendant, which I think is powerful. This is really the height of whole kind of aggressively touring. We are starting to see her rise into movie stardom. Feeling Minnesota kind of came out at this time, I believe. And then we, going into that, she has a lunar eclipse at the end of the year in her 7th house, which I think is pretty significant. Now, beyond that, Beyond that, this is happening in Corgan's, his second house.
Second house. Yep.
Yeah, this is happening in his second house. But also simultaneously as this is happening, this is the Pluto degree for an entire generation as well. So an entire generation who has, those late Libra degrees as their Pluto, they're all getting this, transformative underground current of music that's coming out, no matter where you live in the world, that this is being infused into the culture because it's Pluto. And so I think that's extraordinarily significant, because this really is at this time the commercialization of grunge, the commercialization of what we know now to be like 90s rock music. And this is also, that height of the Smashing Pumpkins releasing Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and the recording of that. This eclipse is happening in an opposition to Billy Corgan's Venus in Aries, so that's significant. So we see this opposition challenging him to do something completely extraordinarily different, right? He's uprooting that eighth house where Aries is, and he's looking at the past, and he is transforming in that and transmuting that into something beautiful and artistic that's very Venetian. So I mean, that is extraordinary. And if you think about even the beautiful imagery that is Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, the artwork, it just feels so perfect for these eclipses, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, if you had the CDs, it was a 2 CD deal, and the first disc is called Dawn to Dusk and the second disc is called Twilight to Starlight. So there's this like kind of duality theme throughout it, which is not surprising for a Pisces Sun Gemini moon, right? And it's like all about just celestial kind of vibes. And I think in general this sort of imagery was very popular at the time.
Yeah.
So there must have been something hanging in the public, the collective consciousness at the time that, just resonates with that. And maybe it was because of all these eclipses. I know one of those eclipses in the earlier degrees of Scorpio would have also hit the Pluto of a lot of the early millennial generation. So we have like, just so much sort of transformative, formative experiences for me as a kid during this time. It's just so, it's a formative, like, what do they call that? Like a core memory, right? Like I have so many core memories from around these years, and maybe the eclipses are a big part of that for me, because I was looking at those placements, those degrees and signs, and I was like, whoa, this hits it hits everything in my chart, really. That Libra, that Libra eclipse is basically an exact opposition to my natal Jupiter, which is my chart ruler. And my parents split up around that time. So, and that was, the beginning of like a more lonely existence for me, but like, and as an only child, but also I was able to delve into music more. I don't know, for whatever reason, we didn't have cable TV at that point, but I was able to get much music on my TV at that time. And I used to watch that all the time. I don't think it was supposed to come through, but it did, kind of fuzzy. So I discovered a lot of bands and a lot of music videos that way, because I think music videos were really a big deal in this era, in a way that maybe they're not anymore.
Music videos were extraordinary deal. And we talked a little bit about like how we became very aware of the inner workings of an entire team during Saturn and Pisces. But it's also important for me to mention, and I'm sure being an artistic person, it's probably significant for you, but I remember that like Sophie Mueller did the whole video. You remember who did what video. Samuel Bayer did Smells Like Teen Spirit. Like this is a time where, a certain artist's vision was extraordinary. You knew if like Kevin Kerslake was doing a video, it was going to be rad, So it takes like a whole village.
Yeah. Michel Gondry started doing music videos in probably the mid 90s for Bjork and Radiohead and bands that are definitely adjacent to what we're talking about, even if they're not. I wouldn't call Bjork grunge, but certainly iconic music of the 1990s for sure.
Yeah. I think this is also important. Like, this is where Bjork can kind of come to visit for a moment. But let's dive into that, because something we haven't spoken about was the music of women in the 90s. And I think that it really gave a really beautiful opening for, different types of women too. So we have, well, we can start at the beginning. So I think Bjork is a great place to start. Bjork, is doing this extraordinarily different thing. It's electronic, it's artistic, it's bizarre, very Saturn and Aquarius kind of feeling. And then, of course, Saturn into Pisces. And then she I believe that Bjork has Mercury square Pluto as well. So her voice is always changing, transforming her view, her lens. But also she was really delivering some triumphant and meaningful lessons to young people. Imagine, if you can, for a second, as many young girls did, hearing Homogenic for the first time and hearing a song, how could I be so immature to think that he could replace the missing elements in me? How extremely lazy of me. Like, a line like that hit so hard to my teenage soul. And
Absolutely. It
yeah,
challenges the narrative at the time, which is, that your partner has to be your other half, that you need a relationship to be normal or to complete you, when obviously, like, no, we're supposed to find completion in ourselves, and that's when we can show up in a relationship. But if we
yeah,
didn't have Bjork telling us this shit, maybe we wouldn't have figured it out for years.
exactly. I think that that's like a beautiful lesson that I got from music. Another one I think that's significant too, just drawing back on Courtney being a figure, something that had like a profound significance on me. And I talk about this a lot, but I think it was extraordinarily important for me to see grief. Um, and I remember at the memorial service for Kurt, how she said, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially she said that 80s tough love bullshit does not work. And directed the children who were there, I want you to go home and tell your parents that 80s tough love bullshit doesn't work. And these are the earliest messages I have of harm reduction, that if somebody has an addiction, if somebody is struggling with mental health, the worst thing that we can do is like let them hit rock bottom on their own. Like, I won't be a part of an intervention because of that. I don't believe in intervention. I don't feel like we should gang up on people. That's just something I don't believe in, especially if somebody has poor self-esteem. So that was like a big thing, that I remember being a significant lesson for me. But also I think PJ Harvey too, I think, was significant because, developing hormonally at that time, being a teenage girl, trying to figure out my attraction and my look, and I mean, just to see someone so androgynous that was constantly reinventing themselves and confident in their desire. I mean, oh, my lover, thinking about the first few lines of that, like really transforming the way we look at relationships,
Yeah, and kind of challenging like how women can show up too, right? Like how
yeah,
women talk about relationships. Um,
yeah,
I think she's definitely one of those artists that I think just is so enigmatic that people are drawn in. And I don't know if that's like a Libra thing or what, but certainly I think the example of just kind of like you said, androgyny, and kind of like going between like masculine this day, feminine that day, neither, both, whatever, and
yeah,
just like treating it like it's no big deal, definitely had some impact on probably all of us who are growing up in these times. So
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like in a way her generation like laid the groundwork for what our generation and what Gen Z is like kind of, you know, thinking about gender expression or relationships. It's a lot more open-minded these days.
Yeah, she's definitely a pioneer, I feel, for that. And then of course, like Alanis, being that, she is the definition of her chart. I feel like Alanis, anytime you want to like do an astrology lesson, she is somebody that really matches her chart. She is a Gemini sun, Scorpio moon, Leo rising. And, I just think also it's Bjork and Alanis have this weird, you mentioned earlier about going to church, like that's what going to concerts are, but I feel like sitting in a room with headphones listening to either one of those records is certainly going to church. There is a spiritual element going on even when both women are pissed off. You think about it, You Ought to Know, there's these very beautiful ethereal chants that are happening at the end of the song that pull it all together. So Saturn and Pisces, and that's like a very defining, chant. Like, and I believe that chanting is one of the best things we can do for our spirit. Like, these are things that our ancestors all the way back, did in a healing manner.
Mm-hmm.
Music is, of course, the universal language. And so those chanting, it's cathartic while also being aggressive. So I feel like she's a great example of that. Bjork also, of course, a very ethereal beauty. Um,
Yeah, they're a Neptune and Scorpio. I think
yeah,
both of them are,
but
PJ and Bjork.
I think the weird thing is, like, I guess, of course, a lot of these women, Fiona Apple too, they have a very strong Virgo placements. So you have to think about the fact that those Virgo placements are certainly getting hit by Saturn too. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, the establishment kind of duking up and challenging them. In PJ Harvey's chart, I think she has a huge stellium of Virgo. Fiona Apple, a huge stellium of Virgo, I believe. So
Yeah.
very interesting stuff. In my
I
head,
wish
I'm
I had, oh, sorry,
trying
go
to
ahead.
a lot of people out, but
Yeah, I was gonna say like all this Virgo stuff is making me think more of like the Lilith Fair type energy, like all this kind of Earth Mother, like no makeup, long hair, like almost kind of like going back a little bit to that like hippie energy of like the 60s and early
yeah,
70s. But with a lot more, I guess, modernized feminist energy as well.
yeah,
Because I think that a lot of these folks have like Moon or Venus in Virgo too, not just like anything, but like personal planets that have to do with expression and femininity and what that can mean or look like. I know that, Venus in Virgo is not considered the best placement, right?
yeah,
Because Venus is exalted in Pisces, its opposite sign. So it's a disadvantaged placement by traditional standards. But I think that there's like a certain power there because it's almost like those people were giving a voice to the aspects of the feminine and the collective that were kind of pushed aside historically. They're like, no, we're going to talk about this, right? And maybe that challenge from Saturn's opposition to those planets was like the catalyst for it.
mhm.
In my natal chart, I have Saturn opposing my sun, so I'm very familiar with what a challenge from Saturn can feel like. And it's basically like you better do something about it, right?
Yeah. I want to see if we can pull a card really quick, if that's okay, for Saturn and Pisces. And
Yeah.
I want to tune in. I brought the Grunge Tarot today. So I was like, let's pull from the Grunge Tarot and see if there's any sort of Saturn and Pisces lesson out there. Like, if you're an artist right now and you're thinking about making something, what is something we can pull from Saturn, from the last Saturn cycle, and bring in and infuse into our energy? King of Wands.
Ooh.
This is actually really cool. Can we
I'm
see
trying to
that?
get a good look at that. Yeah.
I love this deck. It looks like Chris Cornell.
I was
So
trying
yeah,
to figure out who it was supposed to be, if anyone, but I love like the sort of like freedom that I feel looking at that image.
yeah. And I think what it's cool about this deck is like it doesn't go with regular it doesn't go with like regular tarot associations. There's specific songs sometimes even that
Oh,
it's supposed.
cool.
So yeah, so well, let's see. So let's see what the message is with this one. The King of Wands represents a leader who inspires others, putting collective ideas to good use. The King of Grunge deck is somehow different. He travels among the stars thanks to his unwavering faith in the good. He's not stupid. He's known defeat and he's been humiliated. Much like the narrator in Pearl Jam's Given to Fly, the king speaks to the desire for good that is in all of us. He too awaits better times. But don't forget that the fire that incites him comes from the stars.
Wow.
I love that. That's
You
such a
couldn't have pulled a better card for this conversation, really.
yeah, that's kind of magical. Guys, I got this Grunge Tarot as a birthday gift for myself, so I'll start using it more in my readings, but I just thought that that was a beautiful way to really break in this deck. This seems like the right place to break in this deck. um, so we were gonna
Totally, yeah.
I think we were gonna look at the chart that was suggested for me and Zapata. So let's put that on the screen if we can. Let me know when you see it.
All right, I see it.
So for anybody who does not know her story, let's see. So again, a very influential band from the Pacific Northwest. Again, Mia Zapata was in the Gets, and she, you know, was a very influential figure and another person that sadly was part of that 27 Club. She was murdered in 1993 on her way home from a show that she had played. And the crime actually went unsolved for a decade before her killer was arrested in 2003 based on new DNA evidence. And then he was tried in prison for 36 years, which is not nearly enough to me. But again, she was born in Chicago. And then moved to Seattle. They were just kind of at the height of their success. It was really sad. They were a punk rock band. Were you a Gits fan or?
I definitely was aware of them, but I honestly never like did a deep dive into their catalog or anything like that. But I definitely like appreciate kind of that like, I don't know, raw energy that they had.
For sure. So let's see what sticks out. Wow, her sun is right on my ascendant, which is interesting. That was the first thing I noticed.
Oh. Hmm.
Yeah. But wow, okay. So
I mean, the first thing I saw was that conjunction of Saturn and Pisces and Chiron in her chart, right? And it's opposing Pluto,
yeah,
which kind of says a lot about like her passing, but also I don't want to, you know, like with Kurt, right? You don't want to make the whole conversation about that person's passing because you want to celebrate their life too. But it just stuck out at me as like, whoa, this is an intense combo. Again, probably pretty generational to some degree, but I guess
yeah.
Saturn and Pisces was really doing a lot then.
She has a Mercury squared in Neptune. That's another thing I was looking at. So, you know, really kind of being quite artistic, you know, being somebody who probably was very drawn to poetry and the arts and things like that. And then I also see, you know, this Mercury in Libra, very socially justice, probably oriented, relationship oriented. I know she had a very serious boyfriend. Um, yeah, just a very interesting chart. I also just think about Wow. So what was going on like, this was her Saturn return too, was it? Or was I'm not
It had
exactly.
just been approaching her Saturn return, right? If she was
Yeah.
around 27,
Yeah.
it must have been like right before that, which is
Yeah.
really sad.
Yeah. And then there's a beautiful trine that we see from her Mars to Jupiter. So being able to like travel and have like a long stay, her like, that her actions, the things that she did, the things she cared about, how she wanted to create transformation, being part of the underground, she was able to use that to tour, and I'm sure to like, expose her to people around the world, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, look at that conjunction of her moon and Mercury and Leo. That's going to be someone who is not afraid to speak their mind and probably just is kind of naturally theatrical. Um, Leo definitely just garners attention kind of effortlessly. And I think a lot of the people that we have talked about also have significant Leo placements in a lot of cases, which is kind of interesting because I don't really think of Leo and grunge going together per se, but I think there's something to that as
Yeah.
well. Let me see. So we don't have the birth time for this chart, right? This is just
Oh, sadly, we do not.
that's okay. We can still see a lot, right, without it. Um, let's see. So her Jupiter is fallen, her Mars is domiciled, her Venus is domiciled. Um, definitely seeing like some interesting, like some planets are kind of like really standing out in the foreground, and then some are kind of less so. Um, someone who has a domiciled Mars and Venus, I almost feel like they can express their inner, like, so-called masculine energy and feminine energy, like in equal amounts. And I
Yeah.
think she kind of carried that vibe. Like, again, I wish I knew the ascendant and the house placements, but I feel like this person had a lot of like, I don't know, just kind of like earthy androgynous charm.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, well, that was very sad. Let's do a fun one. Let's do before we go, let's do, I don't know, what do you think? Who is like a fun person to talk about and critically deconstruct?
Hmm.
There's so many options. We could do Billy, we could do Courtney, we could do Kurt, we could do Chris Cornell, we could do Eddie Vedder, we could do Wayne Staley, we could do Scott Weiland, we could do
Uh, I hmm. I would like probably veer toward ones that we might have birth times for, but I'm not that picky.
Okay, let's see. I wish we had like let's do Billy Corgan. I think he'll be easy because you already are so familiar with that chart.
What do you mean?
So let's
Well,
take a look.
I think he's a good choice too because he's definitely kind of in the public eye again. Um,
Yeah.
with like Saturn, Aquarius into Pisces, we're kind of like seeing the pumpkins again touring and doing all these big things. And like they recently did like a festival in Mexico that was like luchadors, like wrestling American wrestlers, and there were also rock bands. It's very strange in a cool way. But anyway, suffice to say,
What an
unlike
intro,
some
like I feel like
yeah.
his chart just there's a lot of things going on there. We have like a beautiful grand trine.
Mhm.
What is your favorite part about this chart?
Oh, that's easy. It's definitely the Jupiter in Cancer. In a whole sign chart, it would be an 11th house Jupiter in Cancer, and it's obviously um, part of that grand water trine. So Jupiter's house of joy would be the 11th house, and then of course Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. So this is a very advantaged planet. And I think the reason it's my favorite part of the chart is because it kind of speaks to not only Billy's influence on the collective, but the fact that he actually has always had quite a bit of support behind him, even if it hasn't seemed that way, right? People who have Jupiter in Cancer in the 11th house seem to just attract support.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. It's hard for me to be like, oh, the Sun Chiron conjunction's my favorite, because I know that's no fun. At least when you're young, it's very difficult, right? But I think as Billy is, gone through 30 years in the music business, is now a parent, and, just doing all the things really, I think maybe he's starting to step into that Chiron like healer mode a little more, or maybe just embracing what was always there.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool, because unfortunately, like with some of the other names we've mentioned who didn't make it to today,
Yeah.
we're seeing someone who did, right? And they're still like talking about bullying and things that kind of are on the collective conscious mind. So, which is very true to like a Mercury ruled chart, I guess, right? When you're ruled by Mercury and Pisces, you're going to want to talk about things that hurt people in the collective, because that's what Pisces cares about. I know that Mercury and Pisces is a disadvantaged placement technically, but also I'm just going to throw out there that the data I've seen shows that with people with Mensa membership, the most common Mercury sign is actually Pisces. So
That's
um
that does not surprise me at all. I think mutability gives you the ability to think about things in a lot of different perspectives, which I think obviously helps people's intelligence. There's also social intelligence, creative intelligence.
absolutely.
So yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's many magical parts of this chart. Pluto being right on that ascendant with Uranus, I think really speaks to the physical nature of Billy Corgan. He's a big guy. I mean, he also has this birthmark on half of his body, which, added to some self-esteem issues that I think he had. And so like learning to like love himself and not go off of this perspective of other people or the validation of other people. He's also, an intimidating guy, even if he said nothing at all. If Billy Corgan walked into a room, even if he never became famous, he's a guy with a lot of presence. He's physically large. He's very tall, and, when he speaks in a very direct, kind of blunt way. He can say a lot with a look. Very plutonic,
Very plutonic, very Mars and Scorpio as well. In whole sign, it would fall in his third house. So all that like domiciled energetic Mars expression is just coming right through and kind of cuts like a knife, right? Like
These
as much as
are on his Mars right now. He's like in the middle of an eclipse cycle, which is very interesting. And I think about what you just said, like he has been talking about bullying a lot. That's a very Mars and Scorpio thing, talking about power struggle. Like, wow,
yeah.
like that's pretty significant. I am really glad that he's using that Chiron Sun conjunction to be the wounded healer,
Yeah, absolutely. With that Pluto opposing his Sun and Chiron as well. I mean, that's got to add a lot of potency to the mix. Pluto can definitely break us down, but it also gives us that power to alchemize and transform those terrible things into something useful and beautiful. And I mean, I can't think of anything more beautiful than someone who was abused, was bullied, was, treated poorly, kind of coming out on top of things and using their platform to call out that our culture still has a bullying problem, right? It has for our whole lives, basically.
Yeah.
And especially because there are some younger Pumpkins fans these days. I mean, at the shows, you might expect it's going to be all Gen X dads, but there's some teens and early 20s folks there too. It's like a pretty good mix of ages at the shows that I've been to recently. And I think for him, he's a Gemini moon and it's near his midheaven. So like all those feelings he has, he wants to talk about them. He has compassion for these young people who are bullied. Unfortunately, there was a young lady who was a Smashing Pumpkins fan. She was, I think, 14 or 15 years old, and she was bullied and she ended up taking her own life. And Billy talked about this story and how much it impacted him, and of course, with the blessing of her family. And I thought that was really, heartbreaking, but it was also very touching because so many of us out there listening probably could relate to that young lady's story as much as he did. And, it's a shame what happened. There's no bringing back a person like that. But I think her story kind of being told on such a mass platform, and like they've posted her picture and her story on social media, and kind of as a way to call out like what bullying can really do. This isn't just something that this kid called me a dummy one day and that's it. It's like the gravity of it is so much bigger. So yeah, calling attention to that is really important, I think. And who better than someone with Pluto on the ascendant and being Mercury ruled and a third house Mars and Scorpio to do it. And I guess with all that Martian energy, it would make sense with the wrestling too.
Yeah.
And Venus and Aries, right? They love a good fight. They love theater. They love like the whole drama of it. Which I'm a Gemini Venus, so I love novelty and I love like playful things too. So I feel like I can kind of relate on that level. To me, I like to call wrestling like straight people's drag.
That's so accurate. I love that.
And I don't say that in like a derogatory way. I mean, I love drag. I definitely had the benefit of growing up in a family and in a city that generally was pretty socially liberal. And, like my parents took me to the gay pride parades when I was a little kid. And to me, it was just fun and so cool. And just what I love most about drag is the drama and the theatricality of it. So like wrestling kind of has that same element, but with a lot more of that Martian kind of, I'm gonna kick your ass, but I'm gonna look fabulous doing it kind of feel.
I feel
and
like
it's just so dramatic and over the top. So I love it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. I was gonna say, I feel like that I never thought about it before, but I love Billy Corgan as like this heel, this wrestling
exactly
music. I feel like Kurt is kind of like the reluctant underdog, like
yes,
that everyone's rooting for. And Billy's the heel. I feel like Courtney's the heel a little bit.
Yeah.
What about Vetter? Who would Vetter be?
He's kind of a complex figure, but I feel like he's probably a little more of like, your typical like hero that everyone's cheering on, right?
Yeah.
And maybe if he was in the ring with Billy or Kurt, they'd be rooting on Eddie to be the winner. And then the crowd just goes wild when Kurt wins or whatever,
Yeah. Okay.
That's so funny.
Yeah. I think that's a really great idea.
Do you remember the show Celebrity Deathmatch? Because that's what's coming into my mind right now.
Exactly. I loved that show. That show was phenomenal. There was definitely a Courtney one. I forget who I think she was fighting Madonna in it. There was one with
Billy.
That's awesome. One of my favorite things that I remember growing up, commercials were so big, especially on MTV. And there's a really funny Corgan commercial where he's in class as a child, but it's like Billy Corgan, age like 10 or something like that. Do you remember this? And there's like a fake Billy Corgan. Do you remember?
I do vaguely remember this. Yeah.
And then I also remember there was almost like a drag version commercial of like Courtney and Madonna wrestling each other. that got played a lot.
So
I think
I'm guessing Madonna was like the one that, you know, you're supposed to root on, and Courtney's the heel, and I don't
yeah,
know,
but
but
both drag versions of Courtney. I feel like that's another thing that was really big in the 90s was the MTV Music Video Awards. Like, I feel like that was epic. I remember just like anticipating watching it every year. It was a big freaking deal. I remember when Hole played Violet like live. I remember that, you know, and the fashion and all of that. Whereas like they're not as important anymore, which there's, or maybe I'm just old.
no, I think you're right. I think like when we were growing up, like we were arguably the last generation that really grew up with listening to the radio, right?
Yeah.
Like because I was like a teen in the early 2000s when like Napster was starting and all that stuff. So like we were transitioning from getting our music from the radio or MTV to the internet. Um, so I think there is a bit of a difference now where people get most of their news and their media in general online, whereas like before the internet was everywhere and before we had tiny computers in our pockets, we had to watch the MTV VMAs. We had
Yeah.
to like, you know, wait for the music video we want to see to come on that day, hopefully. We couldn't just punch it into YouTube and get instant gratification. And like maybe it is the passage of time making, you know, the heart grow fonder, but in a way like I kind of miss those days where I had to work really hard to track down a particular rare version of something.
Oh,
um
yeah.
you know what I mean, like going to different shops looking for a particular like indie comic or zine or, you know, single that was only released in Japan or something like that, and now it's like I could just find that on like eBay.
Yeah, I think that that definitely lends itself to Pluto and Scorpio having to search the underground, and then Pluto and Sagittarius like having to actually seek things out. When we recorded an episode of Mystic Mixtape, I remember talking about how my introduction to Silverchair really became this like catalyst for world music and, you know, seeking out bands first that were Australian, but like honestly, like of just different cultures in general outside of mine. And it was, you know, I remember the time where you buy a CD and you might not like what it sounds like, but you know, there you go. That's your money. And so it was a time where you had to take a lot more of a gamble also on music and really bet on,
Yeah.
which is extraordinary. But yeah, I remember reading like liner notes as that was a big thing, liner notes as a kid. I remember specifically, you know, that's how I found out about Jimmy Eat World was through like a Blink 182 liner note. And then I remember, you know, compilations were also a big thing in the 90s, especially for punk music. Like that way,
Punkorama.
yeah, those DGC rarities collections that every band was on. That was significant too. I also, very interestingly enough, if you pull David Geffen's chart, I mean, Kurt and his chart just kind of line up together perfectly. And if you look
That's
at
not
like,
surprising.
yeah, and then if you look at like Danny Goldberg, who was Nirvana's manager's chart, it perfectly lines up with Kurt. You can see why they felt a very instant connection. Um, I have this theory about astrology where if you let go of a relationship, it's just going to come back to you astrologically in a different way. And I have a friendship end. I just always end up having a friend inevitably that has like a planet a degree or two away from theirs or something. So it's like it's just ongoing lessons. So you can never really get away from people or things. And I also pulled the charts of a lot of the early like Nirvana, like Dave Grohl was Nirvana's eighth or ninth drummer. So I looked at like Chad Channing's chart one
Mm-hmm.
time, and he has planets that are exactly on Thurston Moore's descendant, like by degree. So I was like, oh,
Wow.
no, he said goodbye to Chad Channing from the band, but then, you know, Thurston Moore becomes there. So it's like this weird thing that I'm always exploring.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, that's what attracts a lot of people to astrology in the first place, right? It's like this wonderfully like vast rabbit hole that you can just dive into, and it really never ends. There's
Yeah.
always more to learn. There are more connections. Like, I feel like even, if I do study a chart, if I go back and look at it on a different day, something else is going to stand out to me that I might not have noticed the other time. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just so
So
fun, obviously, for me and for you.
yeah. Well, Diana, can you talk for a moment about this new season of Mystic Mixtape? What can we expect?
That's a great question. So this season we have different hosts. So I am kind of the constant. I was a co-host in season 1 with an astrologer named Christina. This season I am with Chris, who is an occultist, and then Colin, who's kind of more empirical thought, skepticism. So we all kind of play our different roles, right? And then we're going to have some episodes where we just kind of like deep dive on a certain topic, the three of us, and then on other episodes we'll have guests. And there's a really interesting roster of people in all different fields. Astrologers, mystics, musicians, linguists, scientists. So we're really trying to expand what started as like a podcast just talking primarily about astrology and music. The way we have today has kind of started to grow into this bigger thing that's like culture in general, and these kind of really like existential questions. So if these kind of things appeal to you, you can check out our first episode, which will be dropping on March 24th. And we should be dropping a new episode monthly. So yeah, I'm really excited.
I'm excited to listen. Where can we find it? Like what will we look for? What do we look for? How do we find it?
So you can check it out on Instagram at Mystic Mixtape. That's the same handle on like all socials. And then as far as the platforms, we're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Music. So yeah, just go on social media. You'll be able to find the page really easily. Appreciate any, follows or engagement, but mostly just like listen, see if you like it. We really enjoy just kind of having these open discussions. As a typical Sag rising and like Jupiter and Aries ruled person, I'm just all about letting people like roam free and talk about what they want to talk about. So I guess that's how I would describe it.
Love it. Well, I will be tuning in. Everybody tune in. It'll be awesome. And Diana, please come back soon. We love you.
Well, I love you too. And thank you so much for having me. Everyone, be sure to check out the Mystic Mixtape episode with B. We talk about the band Silverchair and the wonderful artist that is Daniel Johns. And until next time.
Bye, guys. Have a good night.